In this video, we'll explore local maximums, the pattern of ascending and following a particular paradigm or theme to a plateau, which is followed then by the descent and the exploring of something else. So the pattern of local maximums looks something like this. And ideally, we're moving constantly towards sustainable well-being. But this brings up an important point, which is that it is the movement, it is the growth that actually creates the well-being. Anything that becomes stagnant, that plateaus, ceases to generate that sense of well-being, that sense of happiness, which comes from growing. Now, the reason that local maximums have this pattern is you start off as the innocent, as the ignorant, in the unknown. You don't know about something, you hear about something. And we all hear about lots of things. We're exposed to different environments, different phenomena. But some of those environments produce a sense of well-being, mental well-being, curiosity, interest, stimulation, emotional well-being, belonging, love, enthusiasm, excitement, etc. Physical well-being, right? Pleasure, through the senses, anticipated physical well-being. And so we start to pursue it. The innate drive throughout all of humanity, the base drive, is to feel sustainably better and avoid feeling chronically worse. And so when we come across something that promises or immediately lifts our well-being, we pursue it. So we come across music, right? That's a local maximum. And so it's this wonderful feeling. I remember hearing "Here Comes the Rain Again" by the Eurythmics when I was about 8 years old. And it was forbidden fruit because in my family, there was a taboo on media. Part of the Rudolf Steiner ethic is, don't expose children to all these synthetic, sources of media and toys and stuff like that. So it's all supposed to be organic. So radios, no radio in the house, no TV in the house. So it's mystery. And here's this song, and there's this feeling. I have this feeling when I'm listening to this song that I've never heard before, right? So it becomes then the basis for local maximum, right? So what's next? Well, wiring my bicycle with speakers, right? So there were speakers wired on the handlebars, and wiring that back, and then a better radio. Well, that was next, and figuring out what was the best channel and better antennas, right? So now we've got, hit songs, right? And then what was next after that? Well, a tape player, and then a dubbing tape player to make mixes, right? And what was after that? Well, making these amazing mixes from multiple sources, recording them on the radio, mixing them up, etc. And, the pinnacle of all that was this magnificent, stereo that I saved up for, and then all my favorite music on different tapes and different mixes. And so this was the pinnacle. This was the maximum. That little sensation, right, at 8 years old, kind of crested at probably age 15 or 16. And what was the pinnacle of all that, right? Pink Floyd, The Wall, right? So, just wow, the whole composition over such a, over two records, 2 discs. It was incredible, right? And then where to go from there? Where to go from there? So, right, we only have so much bandwidth. And so after something has its run, it tapers off. And as it tapers off, right, we go back into beginner's mode. We can think of it like climbing a mountaintop, where we're at the base. And we climb and we climb and we come across a difficult face to challenge. We deal with that. And eventually we get to the top of the mountain, the plateau. And we're at the top, then we're at the top, and it's no longer growing. Now it's holding us back. It's time to let that go. Why, right? So you can go down the mountain. You descend down the mountain again, and you have to look for what? Another mountain to climb. And so it's what do we do next? And we're starting at a new mountain. So it's a new vocabulary, a new set of skills. It's a new situation. So we're starting off at the bottom, and maybe this is a small mountain, right? It doesn't last, several years. It just lasts a few weeks. So we climb up and we get to the top of that, and it's the same thing, right? And so in order to go from one mountain to another, in order to climb any hierarchical frame of value or structure, we have to start at the bottom, right? Because at the bottom is the unknown. The vast and infinite unknown is ignorance, is incompetence, right? Where you become competent through practice and experience. So you go from the top down to the bottom, and then you climb up to the top of the next thing, down to the bottom, and go to the next thing. And over time, you learn how to, and you could climb up all of those mountains much more rapidly. You've still got the music collection, you've still got the snowboard, you've still got that old car, you got the clothes. So it's easier to go back. But life is about going forward. So that's the principle of local maximums. And this is, the visual pattern. And it's useful to know for two reasons. Number one, it's important to understand that to keep growing, once we get to the top of something, if we're plateaued, there's only one thing to do to keep growing, right? Well, you can build a higher mountain. You can develop a specialized niche. You can evolve the peak. That is a possibility, right? You get to the top of dentistry and you start pioneering new dentist compounds, new techniques. We used to do this, now we're using laser, now we're using this, now we're using that. So you can build the mountain, you can extend it, or you can climb down the mountain again and begin a new ascent. Because all of the well-being, all of the satisfaction about ourselves and about life comes from making progress. And it's not, you don't go from one mountaintop to the other mountaintop. First, you go down into the valley. So this is a useful framework to understand as we're looking at life. Are we plateaued on a mountaintop and dissatisfied? Right? Well, we can pioneer, we can build the mountaintop higher, or it's time to go down into the valley. And so what I wanted to talk a little bit about here are some of the plateaus in my life, some of the mountains that I've climbed, and also the trap. The trap is that we think it's about the destination rather than the growth. And when we think that, there's a risk of stagnation. And there's always a very uncomfortable point on any mountaintop because we're oriented to climb. But now it's all downhill from here, right? To move to another mountain, it's all downhill for there. You've got to go all the way down. You got to let that mountain go to a certain extent. You can think of it as a relationship. And then you start climbing the new mountain. So what have been some of the local maximums and peaks in your life? And I'll explore a couple in mine just to kind of serve as a reference point. So one of the first local kind of maxims I began at age 12 was channeled entities. And this is starting way at the bottom, right? I'm at the Findhorn community in Scotland, never heard of channeled entities, never heard of channeling, etc. And my father is playing this very weird tape in the car cassette player, or in an old Volvo station wagon back in the 90s, was it? Well, who knows? 80s, 90s, somewhere around in there. And this is his voice. And, is that, what is that? Well, that's a channeled entity. Well, what's that? And so learning about channeled entities, and it was the channel Lazaris. And so, a couple of exposures to Lazaris somewhat casually. And then I got dissociatively depressed, meaning I felt very distant from my body, very timeless space, very depressed. And again, I come across this Lazaris tape. And I'm surprised because I feel completely dissociated and alone in this state. And I'm listening to the tape and it's like, there's a connection. Meaning Lazaris, the channeled entity, is connecting with me at this point. Right? So this is incredible. No human being is bridging the gap here. I'm in this place. The world seems to be in this place. Right? But Lazaris is making contact here. So that stands out, right? The only thing in my life that seems to be making contact in this place. So it's significant because it stands out. It's the only one. So what to do with that? Well, let's get more tapes. So I use my allowance. I'm 12 years old in boarding school, out in the middle of nowhere in the Ozarks. I use my allowance and start buying Lazaris tapes. And it's interesting. I'm not sure quite what to make of it, but it's certainly interesting. And then I fly from Missouri boarding school, rejoining the family in Vancouver, Canada, and there's a metaphysical bookstore where I can rent tapes. So I'm renting the tapes, and I'm making recordings of the tapes. Then I'm requesting tapes at the library. And, recording those tapes. Then I'm buying tapes, recording them and donating the tapes to the library. But, there's a lot of material, well over 1,000 hours of tapes. And so this subject and this subject, how do they piece together? And then, doing meditations and getting headphones and back to the double cassette player, which first it dubbed all that music. Now it's, dubbing the Lazaris tapes, and now it's, I'm using it to tune out the family trauma, right? There's a divorce happening, there's chaos, there's all kinds of, trauma going out in the rest of the house. And I'm, pursuing, this particular maximum of more and more Lazaris and making notes of it all, and how does this tape relate to that tape, relate to that tape, relate to that tape. And then the Seth material, that's another channel. The Seth material comes along. And then there's Return of the Bird Tribes by, what is his name? I forget. And so there's all these channeled threads, right? And how does what Seth is saying correlate to Lazaris? So we have a new local maximum, right? And so over a period of years, getting all the tapes, and then all the tapes that still aren't sold, and did you know there's this one that came out and they're not selling it anymore, and this and that, right? So a whole library of tapes, right? And out of that, certain behavior, certain ideas, right? But then a plateau, right? It's like plateau. It's not seeming to work anymore, at least for now. Then there's another mountain, right? But then later the plateau is continued, right? Because then, after starting a business, then there's enough money to go to workshops, and, going to various workshops. So another, continue continuing that mountain climb. Then there's the online forum, right? But then there's this point where I'm in a relationship with another, quote, friend of Lazaris. That's the terminology. So I'm with a friend of Lazaris. I'm in my first romantic relationship, and she's a bit of a bully. And I'm, dealing with this and that, and she's suggesting this and, bossing me around in this area and that area and shouting. It's like, you've been working with Lazaris for 20 years, and I've been working with Lazaris for 15 years. The tapes don't seem to be helping, right? This is not working, right? So that kind of begins the rocking of the peak. One of the reasons, like, we love these simple ideas, because if it works a little bit, then do more of it. And then when you're in that vein of climbing a particular mountain, the answer to everything is more, right? If you're in the Lazaris community, the answer is, well, have you worked with this tape? That's always the answer. Like, I'm depressed. Well, have you worked with this tape? Oh, you have. Well, then what about this tape? Right? It doesn't transcend the paradigm, right? Oh, you're broke. Well, have you worked with the money tape? Oh, you have. Well, then have you worked with your payoffs for not wanting money on the money tape? Oh, you haven't done that recently. Okay, then do that again. So these local maximums are self-referential loops, but one of the cracks in a local maximum, and it's a good thing that these things fail, because it's a very monotonous, one-dimensional life to just keep climbing one mountain, right? So where it fails is when you start seeing other people doing better at a given area, outside your clique, outside your little paradigm, right? If you're a Christian and God rewards good Christians and blah, 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 and then the neighbors are Muslim and they're advancing in their career and their child didn't die of a car accident. What? God's punishing me? Why? Why did he take my only son, right? So you go to church, you do this and you do everything that it says, right? And it doesn't seem to work. So that's a rattling point. When the paradigm fails. And so first, the rattling point was the Lazaris tapes are making this relationship worse, not better. Another rattling point, people who don't go to Lazaris seem to be easier to relate to, easier to have a relationship with, than people who go to Lazaris. Another rattling point, right? If the pinnacle, is everything's going to, work out if you work with Lazaris, adequately. And so there's rattling points, right? And the channel and the channel's friend, etc., don't seem to be very competent human beings in this area and that area, right? So there's a rattling point. But then stepping outside the mountain and beginning another climb, one of the next things that I went to were relationship courses by human beings, not channeled entities. And I was learning things left and right in the first few weekends. It's like, wow, all the things that I didn't learn at Lazaris events, I'm now learning here, right? Now, the same might have happened in reverse, meaning all the things I'm not learning here, I'm learning at Lazaris, right? But the point is that the ground is often quite fertile. And this is another reason why, the mountain top analogy is, I think, a good one. Up at the high levels of these mountains, it's often rocky, snow, craggly, difficult terrain. Down here, it's, lush forest, tropical weather, gentle trails, nice village along the way. But as you get far up in the extremes of any local maximum of any mountain, it starts to get windy, misty, icy, cold, rocky, less hospitable. The lights of the village are further and further away. There's no room service. And we have things like it's lonely at the top. Well, one of the, I think, principles to learn from that about the territory is that, it is easier to climb a hill than to climb Mount Everest, one, but also that extremism, as we become more and more dogmatically extreme, that we've got to climb on this one mountain. We've got to go from a practicing Catholic to a priest to a bishop to a cardinal to a this, and maybe one day we'll be a pope. That as you get higher in a power structure, it's slower going, for one, right? The rewards are not, per energy invested are not as high in most cases, right? You walk in the forest at the valley and this magnificent rainforest and trees, and that's not up on the heights of Everest, right? So one of the disconcerting things can be in this kind of paradigm is that, let's say you're an engineer and you're a good engineer, so you get promoted. You get promoted and you get promoted. You're managing more and more people. You're no longer enjoying being an engineer. You've got nothing but bureaucratic hassles that relate to other hassles, that actual engineers are dealing with. And you're climbing the ladder, but it's yielding less well-being. You had more fun when you were soldering, chipsets or working out a metal fatigue design or building that robot. That was fun. And it was easy compared to managing 1,000 engineers via multiple levels of management, right? And so one of the things that I discovered was that, and this was a little bit of a rock of that, all that time spent kind of climbing the channeled entity pyramid, was I'm learning more in 3 weekends about how to relate successfully to other human beings than I learned in 15 years of studying channeled entity material about relationships. Right? 15 years, 3 weeks, that's disconcerting. And it's more fun. Disconcerting, right? So, we tend to cling to what gave us that jolt, what we were exposed to initially that seemed to work. We're poor, we're destitute, and a nice Christian gives us a hot meal and invites us to study the Bible, right? And the hot meal tasted great, right? And then we're climbing up and but as it kind of gets on to here, now you're into self-flagellation and celibacy. That doesn't sound so fun, right? The hot meal was fun. The kindness was fun, but how is celibacy improving the quality of my life? But that's the next step, right? That's as you climb the really pure people do this and this. You mean the really pure people don't have any fun? Don't get things done? I mean, what is this, right? And so there is a tendency at the peak or at the extreme edges of all local maximums, right? You try to get exercise. You keep getting exercise, and you get more and more exercise. Now you spend 8 hours at the gym getting everything exercised. And you go running and do this and that. But at what point does the return on investment taper off? It might be at 20 minutes a day. That is the maximum amount of yield in sustainable well-being for your body. If you did 20 minutes of this every single day, you'd get 80% of the benefit of the person who does 8 hours a day. And at a certain point, if you're doing 10 hours a day at the gym, maybe you're going brain dead and you're shortening your lifespan. And maybe you're starting to look a little grotesque rather than more fit, right? So there's this point of maximum yield. But where the trap is all of these things have their own little pyramid, right? And so if you read a book of poetry, and then your next step is you're a poet, and then you're supposed to read all the poems, and then you're supposed to learn read them in French, and then you're supposed to know the syntax structure behind them. At some point, it was just more fun reading poems that I loved every once in a while, right? But the impetus, some of this is the fear of the unknown, right? We found something finally that makes us feel good, so let's do more of it, and then more of it, and then more of it. So some of it is that, right? There is also this sense of rank snobbery, that if you go ahead, the real people, right? The real people do this. The real people read Rumi in Greek, right? Not that he actually wrote in Greek, but you get the idea, right? So now you have to study the whole Greek language just to read the real poets, right? So there is a little bit of that phenomena, and I definitely, one of the reasons I'm making this video is, I felt nonplussed and a little foolish that I'd spent so much time trying to improve my relationship through the mountain of channeled entities, only to discover it was far more efficient taking a different approach, right? And all of these are paradigms, right? All of these are paradigms, and each paradigm, each mountain, each local maximum is a technology. It's a tool. And you can grow on that tool, you can, move forward on that tool, but it's not necessarily the best tool, right? But you don't know that until you've tried, either learned from smarter, wiser people, which is a great local maximum to study, is study and learn from wiser, smarter people. It's very efficient, through the lens of biographies. And that was certainly one of my mountains, was to read biographies of competent, effective people, first through actually reading books, then through audiobooks, and more recently on shows such as the Tim Ferriss Show, right, where the relatively biographical interviews with a variety of competent people. And so, while I was with the, while I was with the channeled entity thing and Lazaris, and where that was kind of peaking, was going to workshops, the next part of that mountain was buying crystals. And the best crystals came from the company that sold all the Lazaris material. Concept Synergy, the best, blessed by Lazaris, right? Also 10 times more expensive than other crystals, right? So that starts its thing. Well, I bought this crystal, and now I'm going to buy this crystal. Because there again, right, how did that start? Well, it starts with an idea, right? Crystals are spiritual. Spirituality is good, so these are kind of softening tendencies. But it really began when I had chronic fatigue from another local maximum, which was about maximizing my landscape company's efficiency, right? Because perfectionism was something that I used to deal with traumatic abuse in childhood. The story that if I could just be perfect, if I could do everything perfectly, then I wouldn't be beaten, then I wouldn't be humiliated, wouldn't be shamed. And so that became a local maximum that continues biologically. There's a biological impulse to just do things a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better, and just hold my breath and hope to be good enough so that I won't be hit, right? And so that's, that tendency had led to burnout, chronic fatigue, right? Trying constantly to be good enough, seeing the glaring mistakes all around me, right? being tuned in and noticing like I didn't, I could have done better there and I could have done better there, etc. And the dread that the client would find out, that I wasn't perfect and shame me in some way, reject me, say that, they didn't like me, they didn't want me. And so, that constant efficiency, I'll use an excavator to do it, so much faster than, would be done by hand. We do this and do that, right? So have to, and then do all this stuff, right? So that trying to be perfect crescendos in a collapse, right? It reaches close to the top there, and it's just creating more and more anxiety because I can't get up even more perfect, but the drive is still there. The drive is still there. So the collapse, so I can't move, right? I'm just laying in bed. Hard to get out of bed. Depressed, exhausted, right? And I noticed this tiny little crystal, right? This 2 inches tall, but I can lift it up, right? I'm not that tired. I can lift it up and I hold it to the sun. There's these rainbows around the room. These beautiful, beautiful rainbows. I feel happy. And I realize with this happiness, I can breathe. I can get out of bed. So there's joy around the crystal. So not only is it this dogma that it's spiritual, etc., the rainbow, the joy, it's the one thing that makes me happy. Again, singular, it's significant because it stands out. So I've got to get more crystals. So I go to more crystals. And then I discover, at Lazaris events, they have a whole back table filled with expensive crystals. I'm going, and I buy this little thing, and then one day I put my hand on this beautiful big sphere. I put my hand there, and I feel this pulsing energy. Nowhere else on the crystal and nowhere else on any other crystal, just this one crystal. It's the most expensive thing that I've ever bought. It's $20,000 for this crystal. But it's moving along that maximum, right? First it was this little $30 crystal that had rainbow. Then it's following the maximum of Lazaris, right? And then Lazaris does tapes on crystals, so I have to get interested in more and more. I have to buy more crystals, more. And then there's this rush, there's this feeling of I bought a beautiful crystal. I'm making progress, right? So then the next thing is to buy a bigger crystal, right? And so that, maximum keeps going. And so I buy this crystal. And then what's the next step? Well, let's integrate crystals into the landscape business. The obvious next step. And then, we need to buy more crystals. So, because, if you're going to put crystals in a landscape, they should be heavy and big and in scale with a landscape. And so we have to buy tons of crystals, right? And so, that's where that particular maximum crescendos, right? So, $100,000 in crystals and tons of crystals and giant crystals. And then, the next step might be to do crystal water feature sculptures, right? So and then that plateaus because nobody buys them, right? This $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, stone, bronze, water crystals, but nobody buys them, right? And so that's kind of the pinnacle. Like then, aren't they amazing? Aren't they amazing? Absolutely amazing. But do I want to keep making them if nobody buys them, right? And so, that's kind of the maximum, right? House filled with crystals, etc. And, one of the pivot points to a new maximum is when you're kind of maxed out and there isn't that feeling of progress and growth. And it's clear that this is not going to bring sustainable well-being, right? Because sustainable well-being comes from the journey, comes from the growth towards it. But once you arrive, and for me, one of the arrival points is there's nowhere else in my house to put crystals. It's creating a problem to have to move so many crystals, to lock the house. So the thing that starts off as the solution becomes the problem at some point in its journey, right? So there's the problem, right? So now that joy isn't there as much, and this awareness of weight is there, right? So that's a good point to focus on something else rather than, buying more crystals. So another thing that I focused on was, from moving from this timeless, spacious, unboundaried time structure in which I got dissociatively depressed to, wait a minute, let's form a routine, right? And so it's a new maximum, right? We've got to form a routine. So let's start with what? Sleep. I'm going to wake up at this time. I'm going to go to bed at this time. Okay. And then I'm going to eat at this time, and this time. Okay. I've got my sleeping, my eating, and I'm going to add my nap, right? So I'm going to do my nap. And then what about poetry, writing poetry every day? What about goals, right? That's another pyramid, but it's also, let's weave that into the routine. Let's do Lazaris meditations, and then writing, and then journaling, and then creative projects, right? And then yoga, right? So let's build this routine. And so, and then now that this routine is so exciting, right? My life is getting better and better as I pursue this structure, this routine. It's getting better. It's more exciting, more interesting. I'm getting a lot more done, 400% more done. Well, we go from daily goals to then weekly goals, daily and weekly goals. Then we go for daily, weekly, and monthly goals. Then we go quarterly goals. Then we go yearly goals. Then we go 5-year goals. Now we have weekly, monthly, quarterly, daily, 5-year goals, and review them at all of those periods, right? And so that's kind of the pinnacle of goals, getting all these things done and everything, and then goals in the routine, right? And so we're going to do goals now, and then this, and then this. So everything's structured, and then we need more time, right? So let's cut down on sleep. Right? We were sleeping 12 hours a day and waking up now let's, sleep 8 hours a day. Now let's sleep 7 hours a day. Let's sleep 6 hours a day. Let's sleep 5 hours a day and a nap. Let's sleep 4.5 hours a day and 2 naps, right? And so that was kind of the max on sleep reduction. I felt highly energized, highly competent, 4.5 hours a day, and then this productive mix of routine and goals, and it's beautiful. It's at the pinnacle, like 500% increase in meaningful productivity and clarity about every time. We go from this to this to this to this to this, and then repeat, and then that gets done, and that gets done. Accomplish all of my goals. In fact, I got so good that I'd get through the year, and like 6 months into the year, I've done most of my goals. It's like, what do I do now? Well, I guess I'd then update the yearly goals at the 6-month mark so that there were some more goals for the rest of the year, right? And so all my goals are getting done, and 5,000 poems in my 20-minute poems and my dreams journal, and thousands of pages of dream journals, and thousands of pages of other journals, and thousands of pages of Lazaris notes, and I'm getting published, writing in this magazine, I'm doing this and this. But at the pinnacle, way up at the top of peak productivity, the top of this little mountain, there's no room for relationship. There's no flexibility. And if I meet someone and talk for 20 minutes, it's like, that was my 20 minutes to do this, right? Someone wants to, connect in some way, and I'm like, I can connect with you on Tuesdays at 2:30 for 1.5 hours. And if that doesn't work for you, then that's it. I mean, that's my window, right? Because that's the only time in my routine where I have some, open space from time to time. And as one of the crash points in that routine was work, right? Because as work starts very small, down in the valley of the mountain type, I arrive on my bicycle, use the client's tools, and do basic maintenance, landscape maintenance. So this is the landscape mountain. So I do, composting, pruning, weeding, mulching, planting, gutter cleaning, etc. on my bike with the client's tools, and make $10 an hour. Very, very simple, right? It's down to the bottom. It's very easy. Lots of work. Lots of people need work, etc. But at some point, kind of climbing up that tool, then there's a truck, and then at some point there's a bank loan, and then at some point there's learning about taxes, and learning about accountants, and then there's getting bigger jobs and learning about various forms of installation and design. And at some point I have to kind of take deliveries of material and start using rented equipment, and they're not fitting into my routine. And the client's not happy to pay for the rented equipment to be sitting around while I take my midday nap in my routine. And so there's a tension between the trajectories of these two mountains. Because the routine says that if you do everything at precisely that time in repetition, it's more efficient, there's less thought, there's no gear change. Like I would get to the point where my body would just fall asleep for 20 minutes, wake up at 20 minutes, I didn't need an alarm. I felt great. And so if you move that 20 minutes and fight it, then when your body wants to fall asleep and you fight it, now you're messing with the system, and it becomes a less efficient routine. Whereas, right, if you don't take delivery of a dump load of rock because they didn't come when they said they would and they're in the middle of the nap, it's hundreds of dollars of chaos and noise, and then you can't work with the rock that afternoon. And so you've got these tensions. And this, this was something that was not easy or clear how to sort out. It's just clear that in order for the landscape business to climb its pinnacle and reach more of its maximum, the routine had to go. Because once the routine started falling apart in this area, those were the cornerstones, and it began falling apart in the other area. So there was no routine. Right? And then in the absence of that routine, I felt very uncomfortable, right? That routine had given me a tremendous amount of safety and stability, and I didn't have to think. Now what was there was anxiety. And into that anxiety, first, what happened was an addiction cycle. It was just around things getting too unstructured. I started compulsively eating to kind of provide a sense of structure of something. And then I thought that compulsively working would be better than compulsively eating. And I had a lot to learn in this vast world of equipment and site development and all of that. And so, that became a new local maximum to climb, and from $10 up to, 14 to 16 to 20 to 22 to 30 to, 35 to 65. And then at that point, it's like, people are not comfortable paying me that amount per hour. So then we switched to the job. And then we switched to a new location, right? So from Whidbey Island, Washington, where rich Californians went to retire and save money, down to rich California, right? So from Whidbey Island to down to Northern California and the tech bubble, et cetera, where the landscape budgets are 4 times bigger than they were up there. Right? So that's, just all climbing, work by the job, work, doing this, doing that, doing more, design, adding lighting, adding water features, doing this, doing that. And so there's this pinnacle, right? But then up at the top of that pinnacle, it's tiring having to remind employees to do this and to do that, right? And then there's the money pinnacle. Like as money comes in, right? Now there's now the business stops being as focused on becoming bigger and more educated and doing more and more interesting projects. So that's all going along while I'm not actually making any more money. I'm just spending more money on employees and equipment and stuff like this. And so at some point, the growing is big and learning all this stuff and getting, quote, more professional kind of reaches a point where I'm not sure this is making me any happier, and it doesn't seem to be making me more money. So then there's a new local maximum. Profit per hour, net income per hour becomes the new mountain to climb. So I want to go from $30 net profit per hour to $60 to $100 net profit per hour. Can I go to $200 net profit per hour? $400 net profit per hour, $500, right? So it goes from $10 net profit per hour, slowly up to $500 net profit per hour. But then I'm still expanding my personal expenses without dealing with the investment mountain, right? So you can make $1 million a year and spend $1 million a year and have no money for investment, right? So that slowly, this kind of movement of how is it that my expenses are keeping up with my money, no matter how much money I make, to this has got to be the focus, right? So it's no longer about maximizing, the nicest food. That it's about maximizing retirement and savings. So so I'm going to get an emergency fund. That's the first thing, and I'm not going to budge until I do that, right? So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to get an additional fund. So an emergency fund and an additional fund that gives me at least 3 months to play with. So achieving that threshold in the money point, and then I'm going to start a retirement fund. So reaching this point in the money thing, then the focus, it opens up where from focusing on this work pyramid and getting more and more efficient and running a company more and more, I'd never taken a vacation, right? Maybe 3 or 4 days to go to a Lazaris seminar, but no vacation, right? So just working 6 days a week and 10-hour days, year after year, no vacation, right? And and vacations weren't really feasible until there was this slush fund to be able to decide, well, maybe I don't want to take that next job, or maybe I want to do something else. So now we go into then another local maximum, which is free discretionary time, right? So we've got free discretionary time. So now it becomes like, how little can I work? Because that's a new local maximum. Like I go on this trip and it's amazing. Right, I went to, first I traveled around Europe. So this is, you could call this a travel maximum, but it's also a time maximum. Because what I'm starting to explore is the idea, the paradigm of how can I work the least amount of hours for money and travel and have experiences the most amount of hours around the world. So that's kind of part of the money pyramid, right? Because that all depends on money. At some point, you have to come back and pay the bills and pay the rent and all that, and then go out again. So that's getting more and more where, first I take 1 month a year of vacation. This is the time pyramid. Then I take 2 months. Then I take 3 months. So I work that up to a point where I can take 7 months of vacation and work, 5 months for money, right? So that's part of it. And then I also took longer and longer vacations, like 2-week vacation, a month vacation, 2-month vacation, 3-month vacation. Well, at the 2-month vacation, it went downhill, right? So I kept longer vacation, but I felt bored, unstructured, like I'd much rather be doing some work at the 2-month point, right? So that tells me then I don't want to take a relaxing vacation for more than 2 months. Well, then I did another thing, which was, part of this time continuum, which was, it was actually part of another local maximum, another mountain, which was relationships. I noticed that if I worked 10-hour days and came home to spend time with a partner, I was worn out, didn't have as much time, didn't have as much space. I wasn't as relaxed. And so I wasn't able to connect presently and curiously and joyfully with a partner at 10-hour days. So then I brought it down to 6-hour days and then 5-hour days. And I discovered that 4.5-hour days was the perfect amount of time. And if I worked 4.5 hours a day, then came home, relaxed, changed, thought about and prepared, then I would have work energy to invest in a relationship. So that's part of the relationship local maximum, right? Orienting rather than not having a relationship based on work, because I didn't have any lovers for about 10 years because I said, well, I'm busy learning life skills and work, and they don't fit into my routine. And so, there's no room for lovers, right? So, but at some point, as that pivots, now the work is being consumed, right, to make room for relationships, right? So and that's why I say you have to come down one mountain in order to maximize another mountain, to get to the peak of another mountain. And so, so I'm finding the perfect time window. And then in my travel, because what am I going to do when I'm, exploring for 7 months of the year? Well, I traveled all around Europe and maximized Copenhagen, right? So I said, of all the places I could go to Europe, the Amalfi Coast in Italy, Copenhagen in Denmark, those are my spots during the summer, right? But there was another problem, right? By this time, I had already done the house maximum, right? Because I had made my house more and more and more comfortable to a point where no hotel could live up to it, right? And so I'm like, why am I spending all this money to go over to Europe and travel around, and the food, which I'd already maximized, right? So I'd already had the best organic food where I'd invented recipes. Right, so I'd invented recipes, hundreds of recipes and the perfect taste. You can't get them at restaurants, right? Because I'm cooking them, right? So that's like how to do the cooking maximum, how to cook faster and faster and faster so that all meals take 20 minutes or less. That's a maximum. And tastier, so faster and tastier, right? more healthy, more delicious, more tasty, more fast, right? So that's a maximum, right? But then you go out, like, I don't want to travel. I don't want to travel because the food isn't as good, the house isn't as comfortable, the bed isn't, like, the bed went from this, futon to this bed to this bed to the finest memory foam, natural latex bed. Natural latex, so it doesn't breathe chemicals, etc., and perfect size and stuff, and then the pillow, right? So there's all these maxims, but they can each form a certain trap, right? Because my house was so nice, I spent almost all the time in the house, right? My company was so nice, I've never worked for anyone else in my life. The food was so good, it's disappointing to go out to eat, because when you really enjoy food and you think, oh, a little bit of mint or a spritz of lime or a little bit of paprika and this, it's perfect. And then there's the perfect spontaneity. Like, I'm hungry for this right now, and I'm not driving there and waiting around. I whip it up in 20 minutes and I want it now, right? And then you go out and they're like, waiter, get me some pinch of paprika, right? No, that's not paprika, that's black pepper. The moment has passed, right? It wasn't the moment. It's not as good as at home, right? So why should I ever leave my house, right? That's a question, right? Why should I leave? If every place I go outside of my house is worse, do I just sit in my house for the rest of my life? That's going through my mind as I'm realizing that in order to leave my house, which is now a pinnacle of beauty, of comfort, of quiet, like, my house has the best silence. My house has the best food. My house has the best light. All light permeates through crystals. From this side, from that side, dozens of lighted crystals provide ambient light. My bed is the nicest. There's no noisy fridge. It's a beautiful setup. It's all, and this is right where my hand grabs it, and that's there, and then there's this, and it's all maximized for me to be in it. And every other place I go is worse. But, the frustration, right, that comes when you stop growing, when you plateau, and you just eat potatoes. Doesn't matter how good it is. Eat creme brulee. It's frustrating to go from something so good that's becoming monotonous, that's plateaued, down to something terrible. Like, okay, I'm going to leave my house, and this is all terrible, right? Compared to the pinnacle, right? And yet, there's this urge, there's this need to grow, to continue the experiment. And so, no place in Europe ended up being worth that. So I started to think of Asia, right? And so I went to the Philippines, and I had an amazing experience in 2 weeks. And then I went to Thailand, and it was off the charts. I went to Bali, I looked at a variety of places, but Thailand was off the charts. It was a 300% boost. And so this is part of the travel maximum. Travel all around Europe and find the best place. And then travel around Asia and find the best place. And then shift from, and so this was the shift, right? There is no place as nice as my house. For me, in terms of everything maximized for my enjoyment, to take the least amount of effort to create maximum enjoyment. That's my house. But I maximized as I went to Thailand, having maximized the travel locations around the world, right? Then the question was, well, where's the best hotels let's travel all around Thailand. So now we've moved from the travel maximum from, Europe to Asia to Thailand. And so now we're maximizing Thailand. So it begins by touring all the 5-star hotels in and around Bangkok, and then finding my favorite, right? Chatrium Riverside in Bangkok, my favorite, right? The view, and then there's the maximizing of the room, right? Because if it's too low, you hear the river boat noise and music of the barges coming up, and the view isn't as good. If it's on the city side, well, then you're looking at lights and stuff, but on the river, looking at the Chao Phraya River, up above the 20th floor, where the sounds below are quiet and the breeze is bigger, right? So there's more breeze, there's less noise. The view is magnificent. They used to be apartments. So each, quote, room is actually an apartment. So you've got scale, size, right? Then the staff are but then there's maximizing the breakfast for my allergies and this and that. So we design with the chef a breakfast that every time I go there, that's my breakfast. And they recognize me. So then we've maximized a hotel and maximized the location in the hotel and maximized the breakfast. And then and then let's do that all around Thailand. Let's go to Chiang Mai, let's go to Chiang Rai, let's go to Koh Samui, let's go to Phuket, let's go to this part of Bangkok, to that part of Bangkok, and discover Koh Samui and Phuket are much better than Bangkok or Chiang Mai or Chiang Rai, etc. So I'm going to go there. Then which of those two? Well, Phuket. Then what area of Phuket? Well, near Chalong, right? Near Nai Harn Beach, Kata Beach, Nai Harn Beach. That has this confluence. About it of, the restaurants, place to play ping pong, kite surfing, terrific massage, amazing hotels, fabulous food, beach views, fireworks, right? So all this stuff in this little nexus. Then what's the best motorbike? So there's all these little maximums, right? And it's a bizarre thing. Some of it can be kind of dopamine and adrenaline addiction that only comes from new and edgy and growth. This is called new relationship energy in the Pali world. But there's a bizarre thing where the perfect thing, when it becomes perfect, you can't move. And so this is one of the reasons why this is such a relevant exploration, this topic for me, as I review basically my life through this video, is, what do you do when perfection feels boring, but everywhere you go is downhill, right? That is a kind of a repeating, theme here. Thailand is the most perfect country. The flight, then you have the perfect airline, right? So there are areas to refine. And there can be the perfect, and you can do little nuances. For example, I interviewed 20 masseuses and masseurs and found 3, right? So there was one man and 2 women that gave 3 times better massage than the others, right? So, so then it becomes go back to them, right? Go back to them. But as each thing, as the massage is on autopilot, we have breakfast here, lunch here, dinner here. We use this motorbike, stay in the best, apartment location. Maximize for this, maximize for that. This is the best time of year. This is, then it starts to get perfect, right? And then there's this suffocation of how do we grow in perfection? Well, you can have small pivots to new mountains, or you can pivot in vast ways, right? Suddenly, at certain ages, it becomes not about the exterior at all, but how much gratitude is there. Now, suddenly it's a new maximum, right? It's the same outer world, but how much gratitude is there? And there's this and there's that. So, the goals, peaked at that, yearly, quarterly, etc. There was writing maximums, which, slowly peaked at 1 to 2 books a year, self-published, that I enjoyed writing, because, there's a whole process around the maximum of writing books. Well, what's the point? Well, I want to write things, and I want to connect with people around the writing. That's what I want. I want to connect with people I like around the writing. And I don't want to sell books, and I don't want to get involved with the whole publishing industry. So let me write a book that I care about and give it to friends, and then have conversations, about it, and, have creative flow and learn things, right? And so that becomes a local maximum, right? Where I'm publishing and I'm writing a book, but there's not a whole bunch of growth in that process, right? That's starting to become automated. The first several books, in fact, the first 10 or 20 books failed, right? Because the first part was the writing process. Like, how do I write a book? I know how to write articles, but the book collapses before I write the book. So how do I write a book, right? So that's a whole process. That's its own little mountain, where I go from, 10, 20 failed books that never have more than a few chapters finished, and then another one, and never more than a few chapters, and another one, to actually writing and publishing a first book, right? It's a great accomplishment. And then it's repeat, using that process. And then at a certain point, you could just spend all the time. I could just write all the time, but, what about living life? And so then there's a bit of a balance, right? Between, when this is going on, I do this, but when that isn't going on, then I'll write a book. And then the maximum around editing a book, like, let's give it to a few people I like, hear their feedback. That'll motivate me to edit it and do a second, version, and then give it to people to edit, and then they'll, have friends and associates edit it as an enjoyable exercise, and then, make the updates, and then do a third printing, right? And then give it away as long as it's on my mind, and then when I'm no longer thinking about it and don't want to talk about it, stop giving it, that particular book. So, that's a local maximum. So, there have been maximums with sex. There have been maximums with polyamory. The whole relationship domain went from no relationships to, a relationship to let's go to school for relationships. Let's go to school for sex. Let's look for better sex, better relationships. Then let's learn this and learn that. And then when there isn't the perfect partner, let's have poly or open relationships. And that kind of pinnacle, up at the top with like 8 lovers in a given week, 1 male, 7 females, growing, talking, like 24/7, relationship. And it's this pinnacle. It's like it's unsustainable because you can't work and, do just about anything and, balance 8 relationships a week. And yet it's this beautiful, it's this symphony, right? It's magnificent, right? It's like this great buildup of, in Beethoven's Ninth, do the drums, and it's this wonderful crescendo, right? But then, it's like, well, where do you go from there? 10 lovers in a week? I mean, it becomes, it's at some point, It makes no more sense to pursue, at least quantity, and then you come to quality, right? And so, in different themes of relationship, right? And so, one of the themes I pursued was avoiding blame. Like in my first couple of relationships, women would say things to me like, well, why didn't you tell me that before? And I'm like, well, why didn't you ask it before if you wanted to know before, right? I mean, I'm an open book. I don't lie. I know myself well. You didn't ask, right? But that gets tiring to have multiple people say, why didn't you tell me this before? And none of them ask, right? So it's kind of boring, repetitive. And so then the question is, well, how do you solve that thing? If I don't want to have that be the pattern, how do you interrupt that pattern and create a different pattern? Well, it turns out you have to have a 10-hour conversation before having sex to cover all the things that people don't know that they don't know, but complain that they don't know after they discover they don't know them, right? And so that started off with, as spending time with different lovers, you complained you didn't know this, you complained you didn't know that, you complained you didn't know that, none of you asked, et cetera, et cetera. So there's obviously a large body of women who complain about not knowing things they're not going to ask about. So if I don't want to be blamed by a large body of women, then what can I do? So this is kind of the mountain of blame prevention. And so, that began by clarifying boundaries and expectation. Then it moved into having ending agreements. You mean you ended like this? Well, what did you have in mind? Well, you had this, but that doesn't work for me. Why didn't you tell me right? So we've got to have an ending agreement. So if we have an ending agreement, then nobody can say there isn't a, that's a surprise or whatever, right? And then there's a clear way to end without hurting the other person. So you have to have an ending agreement. And then you have to have, agreements, right? And then and those agreements have to include, finances and sexuality, et cetera, because so I start climbing this pinnacle of actually transparently asking and sharing all that needs to be covered before having sex for there to be none of the blame game. But at the top of that pinnacle, I find that women are too lazy or tired or don't see the point because they don't have enough experience to cover those areas. And so by the time I successfully eliminate all blame and all surprise and all confusion, so that really smart people say that, wow, this is a brilliant, clear, healthy, wonderful new way of starting a relationship, 95% of people do not want to go through the bother of doing it. They'd rather be surprised and blame someone than they would go through the process of understanding and responding and making, mature decisions around all of that. And so it's a pinnacle, like and then then I got tired of all the other things that never got talked about in relationship. It was kind of a don't ask, don't tell policy where nobody asked and there wasn't enough time to communicate. And so I wrote a user's manual, 400 pages of all the stuff that anyone might find valuable to understand about me, biography, sexual personas, principles, values, protocols, deal makers, what a good friend is for me, blah, blah, blah. So all these things, astrology, this, that, the other, a rounded profile of a human being, right? So that's kind of the pinnacle of intimacy and transparency. Here's everything anyone has ever been, concerned to know about, and that I'd probably like to know about you if you'd like to write one too, right? And so then that hits the barrier of nobody wants to take the time when it's so easy to just blame, right? It's easy to say, oh, well, you should have told me. That's easy, right? But it's hard to think and read a book and understand someone. So that, that was kind of petered out just with, resistance. So it started as, let me do whatever it takes to avoid misunderstanding and blame and surprise and shock and betrayal and all that, which requires a lot of communication. So more and more and more there, succeeding at that, but then failing to create relationships, right? Because it turns out most people don't want to do that work. So that's kind of the end of that, local maximum, which, by the way, is a frustrating one because I don't enjoy being blamed and criticized. But it seems like other people enjoy that more than taking the time to actually, learn and understand enough not to end up doing that. In each of these things, whether it's food, maximizing food, business, then came investing at some point. That's more of a recent local maximum. I'm still climbing that, where the goal of getting to a point of financial sustainability, where I can do all the various things that I might ever want to do with dividends, et cetera, from investing. And another, important maximum that I'm working on right now is nonprofit, giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to a nonprofit that I've formed so that I can do good things in the world with money, right? And since I don't enjoy asking people for money, particularly people who don't want to donate to nonprofits, it's fun to invest the nonprofit's money in good companies like Tesla that's making the world a safer, healthier place, so that I don't have to ask other people for money. I can invest the profits in the missions of the business, which relate to 10x living and happiness data. I've climbed the protest maximum, to a point where it's, both somewhat effective and somewhat painful. I've looked at hedonic pleasure in various forms. Sensitivity, I think, has been another maximum as a highly sensitive person, taking more and more control of my environments, controlling my noise, doing this, limiting to one person at a time and, in interaction. But the sensitivity continuum, at the peak of it, it's just very difficult for people to relate to me up at the perfect point of sensitivity, where you approach me like this, we talk about these things in this location, in these ways, we do this, and it's absolute perfect, perfection for, my sensitivity, and yet, not easy to flow with, right? And so then, when doing more group and collaborative work, maximizing for ease of flow rather than maximizing for comfort and sensitivity, becomes, a different pathway to success, and that's something as I kind of close, because I've also, I've maximized for withdrawal. I don't like conflict, so I will, leave the family system. That was an important one at age 17, just moving out of the dysfunctional family rather than fighting with it, right? So move out. And then, when that where, the friend with I moved in, where there was conflict, they're moving again. And then rather than negotiate and conflict for shared space, living alone. And then, if something wasn't a good fit, withdrawing from that. If that wasn't a good fit, withdrawing from that. And so I've maximized at certain points the withdrawal mountain, right? Where I just, okay, you believe that, I believe this. You do this, I do that. And some of that also, ties in with the mountain of relationships, because in some relationships I've maximized for sexuality, right? So I've been with the perfect lover, the perfect transcendent lover exploring altered states, the most passionate, devoted lover where we had sex 3-4 times a day and wanted more, with exquisite passion. But maximizing for one thing, in this case, sex, like the three lovers with the peak, that I would call like up at the top of the sexual maximum, where I just physically couldn't endure more passion or more sex. One was a quasi-prostitute with some, traumatic issues. One was a Catholic who wanted a normal guy to dress and talk about normal things and be Christian, and obviously that's the last thing, that someone would call me. So I, mentally, everything that I was most excited about was frowned upon, by her, and everything that she wanted, all the normal stuff she thought, if I could just be more normal, was stuff I'd worked hard not to be, right? And so, but most passionate, consistent lover of my life, 3 or 4 times a day. And the other, transcendent, ecstatic sex for, just kind of an unending week. But she's got a boyfriend, and it turns out she's cheating on him. So that, maximizing for peak ecstasy, transcendent experiences, all this stuff seemed to have nothing to do with, compatibility versus someone else. So like the woman who loved and fell in love with me for my writing and thought, I love this writing, this is incredible. But, she had no interest and no compatibility in any number of other areas, and so there do seem to be, these almost divergent things where the person, most sexual is the most kind of incompatible in these other areas. And the person who's most compatible in these other areas is the least sexual and stuff like that. And so, that's, I think that there's a certain amount of relationship with some of these things where it's, if you understand the mechanics psychologically, et cetera, it's somewhat normal that someone who's at a pinnacle in one area isn't at another. Like the best brain surgeon in the world, might be a terrible empath, because they're spending all their time in this area. The most present, spontaneous, amazing person who's in the moment and gives so much energy to the room might be the worst brain surgeon, because they're constantly forgetting the text and all this stuff, and they're just in the moment, right? And then they don't show up for the appointment. And so there's definitely tensions in those types of areas. And that's, I think, also why it's good to go up and come down. It's good to be aware of this pattern. And just be looking at balance at any given point within our probability field, within our possibility field. We are somewhere off to the side. And health and well-being comes from moving towards the center, moving towards grace, towards symmetry. When we're off, you can think of this as a car wheel turning. If you're here, and if this is the axle of the car and this is the wheel, this is a violent, bumpy ride at high speeds. But if you can move the axle over to here, right, if relative to what you've explored and the various balances and imbalances in your life, then it becomes a much more graceful ride. And so, that's, I think, a good recipe, a good ideal and idea for finding the next mountain to climb. Thanks for listening.